Start off with a little bit of your own history in terms of living in this area. Are you from Grand Rapids area originally?
I moved to Grand Rapids in '72 when I interviewed for the deanship of William James College and didn't take it. And then through some negotiations, I came back late in '72 as dean of College 4. And I worked for Grand Valley State ever since then until I retired in, well, I don't know, a number of years ago. So I lived here from '72 really until '78. And then I moved back to Washington, D.C. with my family. That was the time when I came out to my wife, came out of my marriage. And I continued to work for Grand Valley, though. Even though I was in D.C., I would come to the faculty and work with individual faculty and so on. So in a way, Grand Rapids has been a home, especially for my oldest son, and I consider it more of a home. When I retired, I was living in a suburb of D.C., and I have a son here, a son in San Francisco, and one in Washington, D.C., and this was the only place I could afford to retire to. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah. Could you say anything about it all, when your work, your time at Grand Valley in particular, because we've interviewed Milton, he talked to us about just sort of the evolution of what resources are available and what changes were made and what kind of support systems were put in place for the, for the LGBT community. What's your, sort of experience or observation about that what has happened in terms of at Grand Valley itself?
Over the time. Oh yeah, golly, it's incredible how much development there's been and how much approval there's been within Grand Valley for the LGBT community. Milt, of course, was really responsible for getting the partner benefits through the university, and that made a huge difference. It brought a lot of people out who otherwise were staying hidden. I don't think in terms of the overall Grand Rapids community, it's made a big difference. It's still a very buttoned-down place, very much behind the times. I would say to people when I got here that if they were aware of Stonewall, it was to them ancient history, and that Grand Rapids is about 20 years behind the rest of the country in terms of that. But Grand Valley has had a huge positive influence, and especially for the younger people. Oh my golly, it's been great.
Why do you think it is that Grand Rapids is maybe, as you say, 20 years behind the rest of the country in a sense? What factors do you think sort of determine that that's the case?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the influence of the church here. The CRC is very strong, and the RCA is also very strong. And both of those churches are in denial, if you want to think of it that way, of what it really means to be gay or lesbian. And so they have been a strong socializing influence to keep people in the closet. And I certainly found that true with the Gamma group, with the Gay Married Men's group, that, wow, took a tremendous push for those people to bust out of the closet. So I think the repression of that, plus the general attitudes of many of the people who live here tend to be more on the conservative side. You look at the makeup of the legislature, for example. This is the conservative side of the state. The east side is the liberal side. So I think all of those factors kind of go together. Plus, I would say that there's such a heavy Dutch influence here that those families tend to be far more tribal, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of social networks and social conditioning, than you find in many other places. So that you don't have as much of an influx, I think, of people into this area as you would have, say, in a Chicago or a New York or Washington. So the tribal is my term for it, but the tribal social influence tends to keep people in line.
So since you already mentioned the group Gamma that you were sort of instrumental in creating a chapter, which is, it's actually part of, it's a national, there are national,
Well,
there are chapters around the country.
there are chapters around the country. It is not a national organization. I think at present there are probably only 3 groups now in Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, and one in Dallas, I believe. The one in Philadelphia was the first one, and then Washington was patterned after that. I patterned the local group here after the Washington one, because I joined the Washington group when I was coming out of my marriage, and they were very helpful to me. They weren't helpful to my wife, unfortunately.
Yeah. Could you say, just explain for people who don't have any knowledge of this, what Gamma stands for, and
Sure.
when was the Grand Rapids chapter sort of started?
All right. The Gamma comes from Gay Married Men's Association, and it's just a loose support group for gay men who are married and who are either coming out of their marriages or have already been out of their marriages and are divorced. When I moved here in '98, when I moved back in '98, and began meeting gay guys, I didn't like to go to bars, but it was difficult to meet any. And I went to a party at a group that Jim Lucas had formed at that time, As We Are, I think it was called, Aware. And I met 2 guys there who had been married. And we got to chatting, and I talked to them about the problem. And they said, yeah, it really wasn't any kind of a thing. So the next year, in 1999, we basically formed Gamma. The 3 of us got together and talked about it. And I had the literature from the Washington group. And so we put together a support group. We advertised with a few little flyers at Sons and Daughters, which was a gay cafe at the time. And golly, we had 10 or 15 guys show up for our first meeting. And then we met every 2 weeks. Yeah. And we ran along, anywhere from 6 to 12 men per meeting for 2 or 3 years, because I think there was a great unmet need for that. And then slowly over the years, it ran for about 7 years before we finally disbanded, because the numbers kept going down, 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 until finally it was just Gordon Peter Posthumus and I who were meeting. And we said, Gordon, there's no point in going to the network and sitting around in the evening. Let's just go have coffee. So we disbanded. But we probably had, I'm guessing, maybe 100 guys go through Gamma in those 7 years.
What would you say, obviously these kinds of things affect people in different ways, but what would you say is the significance of having a group like Gamma for these men in this community? What impact did it have on their lives?
Well, the guys who came to Gamma, in the first place, especially in the early years, they really thought they were the only ones. I'm the only one who's married and gay, and I don't know anybody else who is. I can't talk with my family. I can't talk with my minister about it. I can't talk to my neighbors. I can't talk to my wife about it. What can I do? And so Gamma, being a support group, we gave them a chance to get together. We would start out with what we called our check-in. We'd simply go around the group, and if anybody wanted to say something about what's been going on in the last week or two, then they would. We did not give advice unless it was asked for specifically. In fact, we made that an important part of the group. You're not here to give advice. But for many guys, it was simply the ability to explain how they felt and what was going on in their life to someone else who understood. And in that way, it was a big pressure relief valve, I think, for a lot of the guys.
It didn't necessarily mean that just because these men were coming to these meetings that they necessarily came out to their families necessarily. Maybe some did, maybe some didn't, but it at least provided a mechanism for them to be able to,
right.
To meet with
I would say that most of them either had come out to their wives or they did while they were members of Gamma. There were a few who after coming out, decided with their wife to stay together and not get a divorce. The majority did go on for a divorce, and there is literature, this book called The Other Side of the Closet. Can't think of the gal's name right now. But anyhow, she's been writing about the spouses from their side. And as my wife said at the time, you know, you came out of the closet and you slammed me into the closet, because she in turn couldn't talk to her friends, she couldn't tell her family, and so on. So the majority did head toward divorce and separation. A few, though, did not. We had one or two who came to a few meetings and said, thank you, this is all I needed, I'm going to go back home and just basically be in the closet. Right. And fine, that's their decision. We didn't try and influence anyone one way or the other.
Well, could you talk about that for a little bit? Because it seems like, you know, it's a bit of a catch-22. I mean, because if an individual would say, if a man in this situation would say that I've come to terms with my identity, I identify as a gay man, I know that that's who I am and that's what I want to be, and all the possibilities that provides, but then also knowing at the same time that it's going to be difficult because, you know, family members are going to maybe be hurt, or because, you know, divorce has to take place. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about just that sort of that it's kind of just a real difficult space to be in, because there's no easy answer.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. I think probably what I would say first on that is that the man who is gay and is married and is feeling this pressure to come out, he has been dealing with his gayness probably since he was 8 or 9 and hiding it all those years, maybe having some furtive gay experiences along the way, maybe not. But he's been dealing with it for, let's say the average age of the guys who were coming out at that point for Gamma were probably 40. He's been dealing with it himself for over, 30 years. It's a surprise to his family, of course. One thing that we used to say in the group is that the guys in Gamma were very good actors, because they had learned over the years to cover up their true feelings and to behave in such a way that they really became super husbands. In fact, several of them mentioned this, and in the book on spouses, it was mentioned, wow, the husband was such an attentive man. And yes, he was, partly just by nature, but also partly as a kind of a compensation on his part for the guilt that he was feeling, having hidden it. So in many cases, coming out was a huge relief for the man, even though it created an enormous amount of tension for the wife and for the family.
Just wondering if you could say something about your own, what this meant for you, particularly. I mean, obviously you had a similar experience, but as somebody who kind of helped start Gamma locally and being a part of those years of those meetings, to, being supportive to all those other men. I mean, what impact did it have on you personally to play that role, in developing this, sense of solidarity with these other
right.
men?
Well, for one thing, it gave me a way of looking positively on being a gay man who was out in the open, because I had suffered through much of the same turmoil that these other guys had. I came out when I was 45, I guess, something like that. I'd known I was gay. In retrospect, I figured out that I was gay since I was probably 9. I had buried it, I had denied it for years, and in fact, one of the dilemmas was in telling my wife that I really had denied it all those years, that I had not been living a double life, as it had a number of guys, and I still have a number of friends who still do that. They maintain a double life. It takes an enormous toll on them, and as it does on their wife. When I finally told my wife that I was gay, she had already figured it out. And her initial anger was, why did you wait so long to tell me? And my response was, I had to be sure, because it's a huge decision. And we tried for a couple of years to see if we could work it out to stay together. And no, it just wouldn't work. At one point she told me, you know, if you'd said you were with another woman, if you were being unfaithful and with another woman, I could fight that. But with a man, I can't. And I agreed with her, because it's such a fundamental part of a gay man to be gay. It's you know, the question that's often asked is, well, when did you decide to be gay? Right. And the counter question is, when did you decide to be straight? Right. You didn't decide. It was right. Just there. Right. So we tried to work it through. Finally came to the decision that we could not do that. But we had worked out all of our anger, not all, we'd worked out a lot of our anger and our hurt feelings. One of her major themes with me was that I had betrayed her. And I acknowledged that I had. I hadn't meant to, but that was, in fact, the end result. And so being able to work with the other men in Gamma who had been through some sort of a situation, it was great to have kind of a perspective on that. And as the meetings went on into the second and third year, we had sort of a cadre of guys who had been in there the first year who hung around. And they really became kind of a super support group for the rest of the new guys coming in, because they all had experiences to share. But it was hard. It was hard on the wife. It was hard on the kids.
So you mentioned that you were 45 when you came out, and I'm just sort of thinking in terms of, particularly if you look at popular culture right now and entertainment media, right? Virtually all of the, and this is not just around LGBT issues, but you could say it just in general, right? But in terms of popular culture representations of LGBT folks, it tends to be very youthful. It's very young. It's people in sort of the club scene or that kind of lifestyle and so forth. What effect does that? What role does that kind of external factor of all these sort of popular culture representations play in making it even maybe a more difficult decision for somebody like yourself at 45 or even older, men and women to sort of come out, because there doesn't seem to be much sympathy or understanding
right.
for that. I mean, where it's like, oh, if somebody's 20, it's sort of like, well, okay, but.
Yeah, I remember an article from The Advocate, which is a gay magazine, years ago, and it was the aging homosexual, and the author of the article was talking about guys who were over 30. And okay, yeah, the majority of guys who come out of their marriages are probably in their 40s or more. And suddenly they're thrust into this other world. Most of them have had fantasies build up over the years of what it would be like to be gay and be free. And so when they separate from their wife, there were a number of them that just burst out into the community to try and capture what had been that fantasy. And they found out very quickly that it was a fantasy that had no reality to it. Because if they'd go to a gay bar, they were all younger people. Oh, there were some with older people, but they didn't fit. And I think that's not only a factor in the gay community, but as you pointed out in your question, it's something that goes across our whole culture. I mean, we have a youth culture. Look at the checkout counter in any Meijer store when you're buying groceries and see, 2/3 of the magazines there have sex covers, and they're all young, youthful, lose 20 pounds in 20 days, look younger. Our whole commercial culture is based on selling youth, regardless of what the venue is. And so it was difficult, and it still is difficult for gay guys coming out of their marriages, because most of them had not been bar people, as I'm not a bar person. And the only place that they could legitimately go and find any other gay person was in a bar. Mm-hmm. Now, there were very serious, illegitimate places to go, sure. And a lot of guys got picked up and arrested, and I have not much sympathy for them displaying themselves in public. I do have great sympathy and understanding for the fact that there was no venue that they could legitimately use to meet other gay guys.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, over the last 30 years in Grand Rapids, has that changed in terms of there being public spaces where people feel safe to be who they are? Has that changed much in your?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't. Not for anybody who's above 30. Okay. For the young kids, yes. I think, what is the term that's used? Metrosexual now? I think that's great, because ideally, when these people who are 18 to 25, when they get to be 40 and 50, I don't think there'll be ever any need for another gamma-type group. Mm-hmm. There won't be a need for gay bars. They'll simply be bars, because these kids mix now at a place like Diversions. Mm-hmm. I haven't been there, but my friends tell me that they mix. Mm-hmm. They don't really care who's gay, who's straight, who's lesbian. They really don't.
Yeah. What's your Bob, since Gamma no longer exists in town, about any other organizations? I mean, the students we've talked to certainly recognize how valuable a place like the LGBT Resource Center is on campus. But in Grand Rapids, there doesn't tend to be much organizational, there's not many organizations that people can sort of turn to that, are places for advocacy for them or for support or those kinds of things. I mean, what do you think the gaps are? I mean, what do you think Grand Rapids needs that would provide more of that kind of institutional support for people wherever they are on the spectrum of coming out, or just in terms of making sure that there's equality and that somebody's going to be an advocate for their rights, those kinds of things.
Right. I sure agree with you that after college there isn't anything. So all the sexual freedom that they may have felt as undergraduates, as soon as they graduate and they're turned back into the larger community, they have to hide again, because the parents may have accepted them, maybe not. But even the PFLAG group, which was the parents of lesbians and gays, that chapter in Grand Rapids died a few years ago. Why? There's still a lot of them out there, but the parents, they're not interested. So they are turned loose. I think one of the greatest assets that Grand Rapids had when I moved back here in '72 was Sons and Daughters. It wasn't a bar. They didn't serve any alcohol. It was a coffee shop. It was great. You could go in there and meet with other people. It was clean. It wasn't in a slummy part of town. I wish we had something like that. I think that would be a great help. Because even within the churches, golly, I read somewhere, maybe it was something that Jim Lucas put out, said there are 750 churches in the two-county area here, and 25 only list themselves as open and affirming. But even among those 25, none of them is, as far as I know, is really excited about having collections of gays and lesbians. The group that Jim Lucas runs, it has a different name now.
It's called GIFT, I think.
GIFT, that's it. Yeah, Gays in Faith Together. That is for people who are religious, spiritually inclined, and have basically been kicked out of their churches. So as far as I know, there isn't any place for an adult LGBT person to go in this community where they can gather and be accepted. There are a few things. There's a gay bowling league. There's front runners, but even front runners is dying.
What is front runners?
What is it?
What is it?
Oh, it's a group of walkers and runners, and they meet during the summer. They meet twice a week out at Reed's Lake, and either walk around it or run around it, and then get together for a lunch, breakfast, whatever afterward. 5 years ago, it was a pretty good sized group. 10, 15 people would show up, and now I think there are only a half a dozen show up. It's kind of declined again. There seems to be, on the face of it, you'd say, well, there's a lack of interest in anything for LGBT people in this area. I don't think that's true. I think there's a kind of a social repression, the mindset that's operating here, that's keeping a lot of people hidden. And that's regrettable.
There are some folks who would argue, in terms of how change occurs on a large scale, like what happened with civil rights or women's rights or other kinds of social movements, that it's really incumbent upon, in this case, with LGBT issues, it's really incumbent upon sort of for people who identify as straight to sort of make it an issue. So for example, sexual assault or rape, that certainly women have done incredible things to create spaces, services,
right,
all those things to kind of respond to that horrific reality. But in many ways, it's really, systemic change is really going to occur when men say, hey, this is not acceptable, and they confront other men to stop that kind of behavior. Do you think that the same thing is the case in terms of the straight community, to say, like, in terms of LGBT community having rights, and again, have done Herculean work to get to where they are now, but it's not until maybe folks in the straight community say, we have to be allies, we have to guarantee that that's going to be a right, and those spaces are for people so that there's not going to be, any kind of backlash or, discrimination or harassment of people. I mean, what do you think about that?
It's certainly going to be important in the long run to have straight people involved in all this stuff, because the LGBT people only represent, 5% of the total community. So what about the other 95%? Let me speak on the negative side of it first, and that is, what I think we don't need is some do-gooders, some straight do-gooders who are out there trying to help us out. One thing that I find that I think relates to this is that in the state of Michigan, as in many other states, there is an anti-bullying law, but it's not mandatory in the school systems. It is mandatory, but they get to write their own rules in terms of what is bullying and what is not. That is a place where I think every person, straight or gay, ought to be standing right up front and being counted and say, stop the harassment of our children, regardless. I've read enough stories of people who are labeled as gays, even if they're not, because they happen to not like sports, they happen to be slender-billed, and so they're labeled, and that labeling is nothing more than an exercise in bullying. So the anti-bullying bill, to me, is kind of symptomatic of the lack of involvement of the straight community in any kind of oppression that takes place, whether it's with gays and lesbians or whether it's blacks, Hispanics, whatever. In a way, it's sort of like the old NIMBY thing, not in my backyard, I think it's a great cause. I'll give you $10 for it for your campaign, but I don't want to be involved,
Right.
And unless the larger community has some reason to get involved in it, they won't do it. But on the other side of that picture, I see bumper stickers for MAD, right. And my understanding is that MAD was started by one mother, right, whose son was killed by a drunk driver. So it shows that what can happen. If I were going to be pushing something, I would be pushing the anti-bullying bill, because that alone, if we could solve the problem, would take care of much of the harassment of LGBT students, and it would probably cut down the number of suicides.
So this whole project we're doing is sort of based on, you know, in many ways, our inspiration for the work that Howard Zinn did with the People's History of the United States. So hopefully that this is going to sort of live on, and thinking that maybe 20, 30, 40 years down the road, that maybe high school students may be watching these interviews, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, how important do you think is it for future generations to sort of understand, you know, where we've come from, and to understand this history and how it has affected just real people?
I think the archive you're putting together is fantastic. I remember when I worked for the National Science Foundation in Washington, in the companion group, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, they were doing a big oral history project on Appalachia. And they were interviewing people and capturing stories that had never been written down, never would be written down. But what a fantastic archive to have. I'm reading now a book by James Webb, and he was raised in Appalachia and is talking about a lot of this stuff. And I know he's drawing his material partly from that oral history project. So I see this as extremely important, what you're doing for. First, it'll be important for scholars. They'll go in and look at it. But later, maybe, well, not even later, maybe coexistent with that, it'll become incorporated into courses. I think the courses that Milt teaches on diversity, golly, I would think this would be a really great resource for them to use. To go in, hey, go and study this on the web, look this over, read some of these articles, listen to some of these interviews. So I see it as really important.
Yeah. Well, in that same vein, you know, for young people who might listen to or watch these interviews down the road, I guess I'm just curious what message you might have to them, particularly as it relates to, you know, how you've been able to persevere, where you get your sense of strength and inspiration and hope about, you know, achieving more equality and a more free and inclusive society. What would you say to young people about what's important in order to try to achieve that?
Well, I guess I'd go back a little bit into my history as well as the history of other guys I've met, and that is that many of us arrived at the decision to come out through desperation. We'd lived with it for many years, and so desperation drove us to do it. Now, other people who are just as desperate don't come out, and they lead squashed lives and so on. The advantage that the kids have is that they are coming up through a time when they have a much broader access to all of these issues, especially the sexual issues, than certainly I did when I was going up through school. Within the group of Grand Valley graduates, and that's a lot of people, I read the other day there's 60,000 alumni already from the place. You will always have a percentage who are going to hang back. You're going to have a bigger percentage who are, well, they'll kind of go along with it one way or the other. But then you'll have the other percentage, that maybe 15%, who are go-getters, who want to push. And they will be the ones who will benefit the most, I think, from the groundwork that's been laid. They will stand on the shoulders of other men, you know, and women. They will benefit from the attitudes that are now being formed among the young people, and they will push them forward to the point where maybe by the time they're 40, it won't be necessary anymore to say, I'm gay or I'm not gay. Well, that's just irrelevant. I just am. I think the the bulk of people maybe will have more of an acceptance, just as within the religious community. I think the vast majority of religious people are loving and accepting people. But you have the fringes, and they're the ones who cause all the trouble. So that the vast majority of the graduates of young people today, they will be accepting, but they won't step out. But you will have 5 or 10 or 15% who will step out, and hopefully only a few of those will be zealots that will cause trouble. The rest of them will be really benefiting from the groundwork.
I didn't have any other questions, but is there something else you wanted to say that we haven't addressed that you think is important to?
Well, I guess I would just make a plea if there are any married men who happen to look at the archive who are still hiding in the closet, for heaven's sakes, come out of the closet. Because you're not doing any good to your wife or your kids or yourself. You're damaging yourself. And better to come out and then address it, work it through, and go wherever that takes you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.